Good evening. My name is Dr. David Canton, and I am the director of the African American Studies program at the University of Florida. And welcome to our annual Dr. Ronald Foreman Lecture Series. In 1970, UF appointed Dr. Ronald Foreman as the first director of the African American Studies program, where he served for 30 years. In 2004, Dr. Marilyn Thomas Houston, former director of the African American Studies program at the University of Florida, created the Dr. Ronald Foreman Lecture Series, where the African American Studies program invites a leading scholar in Africana Studies to share their latest research. Dr. Faye Harrison, former director of the program, was our inaugural speaker, and since then we have had former speakers such as former Congressman John Lewis, Dr. Beverly Guy Sheftall of Spelman College, Dr. Stacy Patton, and Dr. Greg Carr of Howard University. But before we begin, I would like to take the next few minutes to allow my colleagues in the African American Studies program to introduce themselves. For those of you who do not know, the African American Studies program is transitioning into a department, and my colleagues will play a central role in that transition. I'm just gonna go ahead and read on the order of my screen. Dr. Rick Stevenson, you can go first.
Good evening. My name is Dr. Rick Stevenson. I am a lecturer in African American Studies. My primary area of interest is the Middle Passage. I focus primarily on the relationship between West and West Central African cosmologies as an influence of suicide and as a form of resistance. I also do underwater research on slave ships. I work with NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. I'm a certified scuba diver, and I work with an organization called Diving with a Purpose, where we seek to locate sunken slave vessels, document them, and also do site mapping. Thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Stevenson. Next up, Dr. Courtney Taylor.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Courtney Taylor. I am a lecturer in the African American Studies program, and I study the antebellum South. I look at Black girlhood primarily, and I study what it was like to go through puberty while being considered a piece of property. I am also the faculty advisor for the Sankofa student organization that was recently formed in October. And so we have a group of really great students working, and we're always looking for more. So if you are listening and you can join us for our next general body meeting, that's going to be held on February the 23rd at 5 p.m. in the Turlington conference room. We have a lot of great opportunities for students, and we really want to work to help you develop professionally, as well as support the program as we transition to a department. And thank you all for coming out this evening. We're really excited to hear our guest speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Dr. Rishay Barnes.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Rishay Daniel Barnes. I'm a sociocultural anthropologist. I'm brand new to the University of Florida and the African American Studies department, becoming a department. I just started in January, and I am an associate professor in African American Studies with affiliations in anthropology and the Center for Gender, Sexualities, and Women's Studies. My specializations are at the intersection of Black feminist theories, work and family policy, and African diasporic race, gender, and class identity formation. My work focuses ethnographically in the US South and looks at its connection to the Caribbean and the West Coast of Africa. I am the author of the book, Raising the Race, Black Career Women Redefine Marriage, Motherhood, and Community, which was published in 2015. And I'm currently completing projects that expand on a conceptual framework that I came up with in the book that's called Black Strategic Mothering, which is applying our understanding of Black women's relationship to work to understanding how they have strategized for their own survival and resistance and the greater Black community. I'm the immediate past president of the Association of Black Anthropologists, and I'm currently teaching the course Sex and Gender in the Black Diaspora here at the University of Florida, shout out to all my students who are in attendance.
Thank you, Dr. Barnes, and thank you to my colleagues. And as they all stated, we are a program working to become a department and hopefully continue to people come out, support our programs. Looking forward to working with students, faculty, staff. Next up, we have Mr. E. Stanley Richardson, an American poet, actor, playwright, social political commentator, and lecturer. The inaugural poet laureate of Alachua County, Florida, 2020 to 2022. He is the author of the award-winning book of poetry, Hip Hop is Dead, Long Live Hip Hop, The Birth, Death, and Resurrection of Hip Hop Activism. He is the founder director of Art Speak, bringing poetry and people together, as well as the director of the Alachua County, North Central Florida Youth Poet Laureate Program. E. Stanley Richardson is a Florida native and currently resides in Alachua County, Florida. Did I get that right?
No, but we'll talk about
Alachua.
Alachua County, Alachua City.
There we go. All right.
We'll take care of it later.
I appreciate
Thank you for
brother.
that wonderful introduction. So I'm just happy to be here with all of your distinguished guests and distinguished guests. I'm sorry. And how are we doing this? You want me to proceed now?
Yes, go ahead. Yep.
Okay. Also, one of the things that I'm interested in, and maybe someone in your department or one of your colleagues may have information on this, I'm very interested in what happens to Black creativity in a colonial environment. The things that we create, what happens to it, how is it altered in colonialism, and how is it used to rebrand or brand Blackness? And I'm primarily interested in what happens to it through music. This is a poem called Dragon Slayer. I want to dedicate this to our dearly departed sister, Dr. Patricia Hilliard Nunn, who had a profound influence on me. This is Dragon Slayer. I was gonna come out with rifles and machine guns and just violence, but I considered it wouldn't be a good idea. This is Dragon Slayer. Arm yourselves. Arm yourselves with story. It is not assault in defense of self. It is the same as slaying a wicked dragon that threatens your future with fire and destruction. So arm yourselves. Would you allow your village to burn? Would you not save perception? Rescue her from the high tower? So arm yourselves. Arm yourselves with story to bludgeon the lie to truth, to enter into their tellers' colonial slanted house, take back, reclaim the narrative, the shaping of children, the sacred clay. It is not theft. How can you steal what is rightfully yours? A people's past pillaged, their memory stolen. So arm yourselves. Arm yourselves with story to wield a beautiful battle axe, sankofa, and machete. Arm yourselves. Arm yourselves with story. Thank you.
Thank you, Stanley. Great job. And a great segue into tonight's conversation. Kellie Carter Jackson is an associate professor in the Department of Africana Studies at Wellesley College. She is the author of the award-winning Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence. Her book was listed among 13 books to read on African-American history by the Washington Post. Carter Jackson is also co-editor of Reconsidering Roots, Race, Politics, and Memory. She is the co-host of the podcast, This Day in Esoteric Political History. You can follow her on Twitter at K Carter Jackson. Without further ado, Dr. Kellie Carter Jackson.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I tell everyone that Black History Month is like retail at Christmas for Black historians. It is wild and crazy and busy, but I just consider it such an honor and a privilege to be able to talk about my work and share stories with you, stories that maybe you're not familiar with, or maybe stories that you have heard of before, but it feels good to hear them again. So, and also stories that I think will be challenging. You know, this topic of violence and force and freedom is not an easy pill to swallow. And so I want to start by sharing my screen. I'm going to share some slides with you. I'm going to talk to you about this history and about the core arguments in my book, and then we'll open it up for questions at the end. So bear with me while I share my screen. Okay. Can I get a thumbs up if you can see my screen? Yeah, okay, great. All right. So I'm gonna tell you a story first. I had a student who was in my class and he raised his hand and said, "Who is Harriet Tubman?" And I was like, "What?" Normally I try not to judge my students, but I was like, "What? I don't, before I could even answer, he goes, "Oh, I remember. She's the woman who wouldn't get off the bus." And I was like, no, that's not who she is at all. No. And so thankfully, you know, my students kind of pounced on him and told him who Harriet Tubman was. But I laughed a little bit because I realized that so much of American history is taught to us in this way, in what Chimamanda Adichie calls the danger of the single story, in which we're presented with like one great Black man and one great Black woman, and that's all that Black history becomes over and over again. And I noticed a pattern. It's like one per century. So I feel like in the 18th century, it's Crispus Attucks, who's the first, you know, casualty of the American Revolution, and Phillis Wheatley, first published poet, and one great Black man, one great Black woman, and that's pretty much it. And the 19th century, it's Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, again, one great Black man, one great Black woman. You know what it is in the 20th century. It's our friends, MLK and Rosa Parks. And I think in the 20th century, you know, I know Obama and Oprah, like I feel like that's the one great Black man and one great Black woman of the century. We know them, we know their accomplishments, and we don't know anybody else. And so a big part of my research was pushing back on this single story narrative and showing my students that the abolitionist movement is huge, it's big, and it is not just great white men trying to free the oppressed. It is not just about William Lloyd Garrison or Uncle Tom's Cabin or things that are produced by white people. That the abolitionist movement is big and broad, and you can be white and Black, or born free, or born enslaved, or a fugitive, or poor, or wealthy. There's a whole gamut of things that you can be, and the abolitionist movement makes up all of these different people. There were hundreds of, if not thousands, of abolitionists, and so what I really want to try to do is talk about them in my work and center their leadership. But one of the things that I do that a lot of my colleagues haven't done until recently is I center Black abolitionists, and I place them at the center because no one needed to tell enslaved people that slavery was wrong. Like they knew that already and had really been advocating for the end of slavery from the moment that they were enslaved. And so I wanted to really focus on Black abolitionists and kind of take back that narrative that has been put out there for so long by other white historians that have not given the credit or pointed the leadership of the movement toward Black people. So the first thing I argue is that Black abolitionists are the first abolitionists. This comes straight out of one of my favorite historians, Benjamin Quarles, who talks about in his book, Black Abolitionists, that Black abolitionists were the first abolitionists. They're the first people to start advocating for their freedom. I also think Black abolitionists are important because they connect us to broader traditions of Black resistance. So a lot of times my students will look at my book and they'll be like, oh, is this like Malcolm X and MLK? And I'm like, yes, exactly, but 100 years earlier, right? Everything that we sort of think about in the long freedom struggle has its origins, much of it has its origins in the abolitionist movement. And then, of course, I really want to push back on this idea of white paternalism, this idea that the abolitionist movement was a white man's struggle to end slavery. And it puts forth this narrative in which white people get to be the villain, that is the big bad South, and then the hero that is like the great moral North. And I didn't want to have that narrative get perpetuated over and over again within Force and Freedom. And then lastly, and this might be one of the most important reasons as well, is that Black people were the most susceptible to bearing the brunt of pro-slavery violence. That when we think about the abolitionist movement and the antebellum period, it's Black churches that are destroyed, Black schools that are destroyed, Black businesses that are destroyed, Black men and women that are lynched or killed. And so I really wanted to, again, show that this was also a group that was facing the brunt of that violence. So lastly, I talk about Black abolitionists, and I think for probably the most important reason, other than them being first, is because they have a twofold mission. And that mission is to advocate for emancipation and equality, because they understand that emancipation is a first step. It's not an end game. This is where we start the story with emancipation, that you just can't free the enslaved and not talk about equality. It had to be a movement that included both of these ideas. And oftentimes, a lot of white abolitionists were like low-key racist. So like my professor, Greg Carr at Howard, said that like white abolitionists approached the abolitionist movement like a Free the Whales campaign. I was like, free the whales, don't hurt the whales. But whales can't vote and whales can't marry my daughter and whales aren't really people. That is sort of the way that the abolitionist movement was presented through a white lens. And so Black leaders are like, no, emancipation and equality, we're human beings, we are citizens, we are deserving. So Joshua Easton also has this great quote that I think encapsulates emancipation and equality. And he says this very prophetic word in like 1837. He says, abolitionists may attack slaveholding, but there's a danger still that the spirit of slavery will survive in the form of prejudice after our system is overturned. Our warfare ought not be against slavery alone, but against the spirit which makes color a mark of degradation. The spirit which makes color a mark of degradation. And for me, this was so important because I think that we can all look at the institution of slavery and say, well, it's abolished, you know, the 13th Amendment. Well, unless you commit a crime, but we're not going to talk about mass incarceration right now. We can look at the 13th Amendment and say it abolished slavery. But we live in a world that is very much operating with the spirit of slavery that makes color a mark of degradation. We're still dealing with anti-Blackness. And how do we navigate anti-Blackness and white supremacy is something that we are still fighting. So the danger still is there. So there are a couple questions I want you to think about as I give this talk today, and I'm going to pull all four of them up. The first question is, what is violence? And is violence ever justified? And I ask what is violence because I think we have to be very specific and careful about how we use language. And that is because, you know, when we think about someone who was killed like Mike Brown or Trayvon Martin or Breonna Taylor, that's clearly violence. But when we talk about someone throwing a rock or setting a car on fire or breaking a window, we also call that violence. And I think there's a difference between the destruction of property and the destruction of people, and that we should never put people and property on the same platform. So, you know, parceling that out, what is violence, what is destruction of property, two totally different things in my mind. And I think we should also ask ourselves, when is violence ever justified? When is violence useful? And I'm gonna get into that a little bit more. I know people might be a little skittish about what violence justified, but I want to sort of push back on the way that we have marginalized violence as this horrible bad thing and try to have honest conversations about how Americans love violence. They love violence. They have a romantic relationship with violence, that they think about the American revolutionaries and give me liberty or give me death. And there is very much a way in which violence becomes a seductive way through which we can understand white power. The second question I want to ask is, how should the oppressed respond to their oppressors? What is the appropriate way? What is the appropriate channels for oppressed people to respond to their oppressors? And what happens if you're oppressed and you don't have traditional channels like the ballot? You can't go to courts because you can't sue and you can't testify and you can't sit on a jury. Then how should the oppressed respond to their oppression? The third question is, how should the nation respond to political dissent? What is the role of the federal government in responding to marginalized people, oppressed people, to the enslaved? Do they have a responsibility in how they should care for the people that operate within, within their nationhood or within their state? And then lastly, and this is kind of a question that ties into the second question, but how do the powerless procure power? How do the powerless procure power? So if we are talking about enslaved people, how do you get free, right? Like, if there's no, loophole, if you're just waiting for your master to die and hope that he wills you free, or if it's all up to you and you have to escape or run away, how do enslaved people go about doing that, getting power and also getting freedom? So I want to sort of give a lay of the land. I think it's important for those who are unfamiliar with this topic to talk about what is moral suasion and what is nonviolence before we get into violence. And moral suasion was something that dominated all of the 1830s. This is when the abolitionist movement really gets its official sort of start date, when William Lloyd Garrison starts the Liberator and he starts the American Anti-Slavery Society. And he says, we're going to be nonviolent, we're going to be non-resistant, we are going to morally persuade slaveholders that slavery is wrong. And one of the ways that they do this is they use the Great Awakening, which is this religious revival in which all across the country, people are saying, Christ is coming back, Christ is coming back, and don't let him find you a slaveholder, right? So people are trying to use the Bible and to call out slavery as a sin to get people to want to repent, free their slaves, and thereby end the institution of slavery. The irony of moral suasion is that all throughout the 1830s, abolitionists are facing anti-abolitionist mobs or anti-abolitionist riots. And all throughout the country, you have this violent tension that's taking place. So every little pinpoint on that map represents an anti-abolitionist mob attack or campaign that took place. So places like Alton, Illinois, if you're thinking about Eliza Lovejoy, places where there's like no Black people, like Maine, or like 2 Black people, there's an anti-abolitionist campaign in places like Boston and Providence. But even if you consider a place like Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, right? And you look at all their anti-abolitionist riots, you've got one in 29 and 34 and 35 and 38 and 42 and 49. Like, these anti-abolitionist campaigns are taking place all over the country and throughout the North in places that we necessarily would not expect. And all during this moment, someone like Elijah Lovejoy is saying, hey, listen, we need to turn the other cheek. We need to not return violence for violence. When Elijah Lovejoy shows up with his rifle in hand to sort of like fend off the mob, well, he's a martyr, but he's not a Christian martyr because he shouldn't have used guns. Like, that's what William Lloyd Garrison is saying. And it's interesting how Black people respond to this, because, and I say this in the book, that if moral suasion is the house that William Lloyd Garrison built, Black people are merely renters. Like, they don't own these ideas. They are not like cemented in these ideas. And everything about moral suasion really changes when the 1850s hit, when you get a little thing called the Fugitive Slave Law. Now, I'm going to take you back to like 8th grade history when we learned about the Compromise of 1850. And if you look at this map, you'll see that the country is pretty much divided when it comes to slave states and free states. And that with each new piece of land or territory that comes into statehood, there's contestation over, is this going to be a slave state? Is this going to be a free state? Who's going to control political power? Who's going to control economic power? And so one of the ways that they sort of stave off what later becomes the Civil War is they come up with a compromise. And part of the compromise that was developed by a senator by the name of Henry Clay was that, okay, we'll give everybody a little bit of what they want. Everybody will be happy, and essentially no one will be happy, because that's kind of compromise. But California will come in as a free state. The slave trade will be prohibited in Washington, D.C. This is really important because slaveholders that were elected officials in the South would come to Washington, D.C. with their slaves to serve them while they were like making laws and legislation. And so they couldn't ban slavery in the nation's capital, but they could say, all right, you can no longer buy and sell and trade within the nation's capital. Texas loses the boundary dispute with New Mexico, but what does the South get? The South gets no slavery restrictions in Utah or New Mexico. They get to keep their slaves when they come to Congress in Washington, D.C. Texas gets $10 million, but here is the real kicker, or the real piece de resistance of the fugitive of the Compromise of 1850, and that is the Fugitive Slave Law. And the Fugitive Slave Law is such a game changer, especially for free Black people, because now that Mason-Dixon line that was kind of like, hey, South, you stay down here, hey, we're up here in the North, that gets moved all the way up to Canada's border. Basically, there is no way that you can protect yourself as a free Black person or a fugitive person, or what we're now calling freedom seekers living in the North. And this fugitive slave law is actually an old law. It was on the books in like 1793. You know, George Washington's using it to return his runaway slaves that flee from him during the Revolution. Imagine that you're fighting the American Revolution and you have slaves running away, and you are sending slave catchers to return your property while you fight for liberty and independence. You know, the hypocrisy knows no bounds, but that's another story. The Fugitive Slave Law, though, when it was operating during George Washington's day, did not really have teeth on it. So there was no way to kind of enforce it. So when they revamped this law in 1850, they put teeth on it. They say, hey, there's no statute of limitations on this. So if you ran away 5 days ago, 5 years ago, if you've been living longer in freedom than you have in slavery, doesn't matter. You are susceptible to being captured, kidnapped, and taken back to your slaveholder. If someone says, hey, you look like Tommy, are you Tommy? Then, you know, you can effectively be sent back to the South and not have a chance to stand trial or sit on a jury or give testimony that says otherwise. If you are a white Northerner and you're just standing on the corner and a US Marshal comes up to you and says, hey, help me get Tommy, and they deputize you on the spot, you have to help retrieve this fugitive slave. And if you don't, you can be fined $1,000, you can be thrown in jail for up to 6 months. So this law really enrages the North, because they're like, what are we, employees for slaveholders? Are we working for you now? We're working to give you your property back. I don't want any part of that. And the federal government basically says, no, everyone must play a role in making sure that enslaved people are returned to their property owners. So as you can imagine, a lot of Black people in this moment are like, nah, miss me with that law, right? Martin Delaney, one of my favorite Black abolitionists, says something I think is remarkable. He says, if an officer searching for fugitives crosses the threshold of my door and I do not lay him a lifeless corpse at my feet, I hope the grave may refuse my body a resting place, and my righteous heaven, the righteous heaven, my spirit a home. So basically, he's like, I wish somebody would come up to my block. I wish somebody would come up to my door searching for fugitives. Like, people take basically two stances, and that is to either flee or fight. It is that dire in the Black community. Now, a lot of people leave and they go to Canada or they go to Europe or they find ways to get out of Dodge. But a lot of other people are like, no, this is my community, this is my home, I'm staying. And then there's the middle ground in which people have to do both, right? And in the course of fleeing, they have to fight. And so I talk about all of this within Force and Freedom, about the hard and difficult choices that Black leaders and Black communities have to make in face of this new law. So one of the stories I tell is about William Parker. And this is the Lancaster Black Self-Protection Society that him and his wife and his neighbors form to protect fugitive slaves. And he basically says, the laws of personal protection are not made for us. and we are not bound to obey them. If a fight occurs, I want the whites to keep away. They have a country and may obey the laws, but we have no country. And when he says this, it's like 1851. So this is about 6 years before the Dred Scott decision, which basically says, no, Black people, you have no rights, but your white man is bound to respect. William Parker was like, there's no police force that's going to protect us. There's no one who is going to look out for us. We have to do this ourselves. And so they get Black people and other white people who are willing to sort of ally with them and say, hey, be a part of this protection society. If you hear about slave catchers, you let us know. If you see someone, you know, that's got a Southern accent or looks unfamiliar, you let us know. And so they basically commit themselves to having this platform that they will protect enslaved people, even at the risk of their own lives. And this commitment really gets put to the challenge with the Christiana resistance. And the Christiana resistance is a great story that I tell in the book. It may be familiar to some of you, in which William Parker and his wife, Eliza, have set up shop in their home and really used their home as a stop on the Underground Railroad, as a refuge that enslaved people can go to when they're like on their way further north, or they're trying to get supplies or a meal before they get to Canada or wherever it is that they're heading. And on one particular day, 4 enslaved men come to William Parker's home, and William Parker lived in Pennsylvania, which is important. It's right on the border of Maryland. Maryland's a slave state. Pennsylvania is a free state. And a lot of people left Maryland because of its proximity, you know, to Pennsylvania. Frederick Douglass is one of them. Harriet Tubman is also from Maryland. They all leave. But these 4 fugitives, they get to William Parker's house and they're like, hey, can you give us shelter? Can you take us in? And he's like, absolutely. Come on upstairs, hide in the attic. Within a matter of hours, Edward Gorsuch, who was the slaveholder to these 4 men, comes with the U.S. Marshal, his nephew, his son, and a handful of other people, and says, hey, I know about your reputation. I know you have my fugitive slaves and you have my property, and I want them back. And William Parker basically says, over my dead body, you are not getting these men. And his wife Eliza is like, yo, what do you want me to do? You want me to sound the alarm? Let's sound the alarm. You want to go? Let's go. So she's like, okay, I'm gonna do it. She goes into the attic. She starts blowing a horn. And I wish you could see from this picture. There are other sketches in which you see Elijah like blowing a horn from the attic of their house. And she sounds the alarm for the Black Self-Protection Society. And within moments, you know, Edward Gorsuch, the U.S. Marshal, his son, his nephew, they are surrounded by 80 men and women, Black and white, armed to the nines with rifles and pistols and, you know, farm equipment, rakes, whatever you could get to sort of defend yourself. And they say, you will not take these 4 men. And then what I think is crazy is that no one really knows who fires the first shot, but shots are fired. And Edward Gorsuch lay dying on the ground. It's interesting too, because when you look at this picture, you know, you see one white man who's like, let's get out of here. There's another white man behind him. The U.S. Marshal takes off. The nephew takes off. The son is badly wounded. You can see him almost about to fall. You see Edward Gorsuch, his hat has fallen. His pistol has fallen by his side. He's lying on the ground. He's dying. And then William Parker says something that's like one of my favorite lines. Did I include it? I think I included. Maybe not. I thought it was in one of the slides. He says, and the women put an end to him. The women put an end to him. And I had to stop and like sit with that line, because I was like, wow, violence is not monopolized by men. Women too have good reason, as a matter of fact, more reason to resort to violence, to resort to force than their male counterparts. And they do. And there was no shame. Now, I don't know if they slit his throat. I don't know if they just like snuffed him out, you know, but they put an end to Edward Gorsuch. And what I love about Eliza Parker is that she armed herself too with the corn cutter. Now, a corn cutter was like a tool that was used to cut corn. It's basically like a machete, if you will, or a scythe, if you will. But not only does she arm herself with a corn cutter, a tool I'm sure she knew how to use, but she says this, she says that she would chop off the head of the first member of their band who tried to give them up. So before like all of this chaos takes place, Elijah's brother is like, yo, give him up, son, give him up. Like, we don't want any trouble. And she pulls out that corn cutter for her brother before she gives it, to Edward Gorsuch. But again, the women putting it into him, the women being forceful, the women playing a pivotal role is something that I often always think we should stop and pause to talk about, because a lot of times we talk about the mob like it's all male. We talk about crowds and gatherings, and we forget that women are always present. We don't include them. But Eliza Parker plays a major role in this. If it was not for her smart thinking to alarm the Black Self-Protection Society, we could have a completely different outcome within the history books. So I want to talk about a couple other people that I think are really remarkable too. If William Parker was like Pennsylvania's hero, I think about Lewis and Harriet Hayden. They are like Boston's like VIPs. They are so important within the abolitionist institution. I like to joke with my students that I say Lewis Hayden's like my historical boyfriend. I absolutely adore him. And I love how he just takes such an incredible stance against the fugitive slave law, and more importantly, against the institution of slavery. What I think is also remarkable about Lewis Hayden is that he was also enslaved in Kentucky, and he had a wife and son that he was sort of married to. Slaves weren't allowed to be married, but we'll say effectively married for their own purposes. And his son and his wife were sold away from him. And the person who purchased his wife and son was none other than Henry Clay, the man who had orchestrated and put together the fugitive slave law. And at the moment, Lewis Hayden confronted Henry Clay and basically said, like, why did you sell my wife and child? Where are they? And Henry Clay sort of, snarkily says, they're my property. I can do with them whatever I want. And it's shortly after that Lewis Hayden says, I'm leaving. And he finds another wife to be with named Harriet. They get married, they escape together, and they move a bunch of different places, but they pretty much settled in Boston and say that they are going to also make sure that anyone who wants freedom will get it. And so they set up their shop within their home. They have their own vigilance society. They are heavily armed. He always kept bodyguards at the end of his block. He was known for having housed William and Ellen Craft. They're two enslaved people who disguised themselves. Ellen disguised herself as a white man, a crippled man, and they pretty much board a train and take the train all the way to freedom. The first place they go when they get to Boston is Lewis and Harriet Hayden's home, and they also get married within their home. There's just some remarkable stories about the Haydens. But one of the things that I laughed out loud with when I found this out was that there's sort of an urban legend that Lewis Hayden always kept kegs of gunpowder inside his front door, so that when slave catchers came to his home, looking for enslaved people, he would open the door with a candlestick and he would say to them this. He would say, you can leave in peace, or you can leave in pieces. And he would show them the 2 kegs of gunpowder. Like, you want to do this? Do you want to do this? You want to go? Right? Like, no one called his bluff. No one. But again, it's just incredible to me that these were the limits. These were the tactics and the strategies that Black abolitionists were taking up in order to defend themselves, in order to defend their community, their kin. It's what I call protective violence. It's not just about individual self-defense. Protective violence involves the collective in the community. It's how we protect Black humanity wholesale. So there were these ads that you would see all throughout the North, particularly in Boston. This one says, fugitive slaves, attention. The slave hunter is among us. Be on your guard and arrest his plan for the night. Be ready to receive them whenever they come. They had, women also serving on the lookout, because women worked in the boarding houses and they worked in the places in which people would come in and out of, and they would be like the eyes and the ears for other Black men that would handle anyone that they thought was suspect. So I want to read a small part of the book and then start to wrap up, just a couple paragraphs. But this is a story that I think bears reading because it's kind of hard to sort of share. but hopefully we'll also get you excited about reading and thereby purchasing for Second Freedom. But this is what I want to tell you about John Anderson, who talks about his escape from slavery and what he had to do to escape from slavery. Now, I couldn't find a picture of John Anderson, but we know that he's speaking in Canada. We know that he's speaking before an interracial crowd. The two pictures here are one of William Lloyd Garrison speaking and the other Frederick Douglass speaking at Tremont Temple, but that's really just there for optics. So here's the story of John Anderson. It says, when John Anderson, an escaped slave who had fled to Canada, gave his testimony before an audience, he received a great and prolonged cheering. As Anderson approached the crowd, he modestly declared that he was not used to public speaking, and he only wanted to say a few words about his experiences and escape from slavery. He reported that in order to escape bondage, he had to cut and run and fight and shed blood. Quote, "I don't like to shed blood," he added. "That's what's called fighting in war, I believe." The audience erupted with cries of, "You did right," and "Hear, hear." Anderson, heavy with regret, told the audience that he had tried everything in his ability to evade his pursuer and avoid killing him. He had warned his pursuer that if he continued to follow him, he would slay him. Pursued for 2 or 3 hours longer, Anderson recounted that the man would not leave him, and so he killed him. Again, the audience erupted with affirmation, "Bravo, and you did right." He concluded that while he regretted his actions, it was the only alternative to prevent from being taken back into bondage. He claimed he was a Christian man and hoped that after the murder, he could still be considered a godly man. The crowd erupted again, shouting, "It is a justifiable act." The Reverend Chairman of the meeting proclaimed that if there was any kind of defense that was right, then one should fully endorse the opinion so loudly expressed in this meeting. Then the chairman added, "John Anderson did perfectly right. Does our fugitive friend look like a murderer?" The response of the audience was resounding, "Hear, hear, and no, no." The days of non-resistance were over. Now a fugitive slave could kill his pursuer and produce excitement and applause in public spaces. He could even still be considered a Christian. And so at the end of this chapter, this is in chapter 2, I talk about how Black leaders became the most political figures who ran not for office, but for freedom. That violence would be the new political tool for the oppressed, the new method of casting a ballot for progress. And so when I think about Black abolitionists and how they came to certain conclusions, certain last resorts, if you will, about how they would address the institution of slavery, I'm reminded of what Frederick Douglass said. This is the ballot or the bullet speech. And I think a lot of people credit Malcolm X with the ballot or the bullet speech. But again, 100 years earlier, just a month before Lincoln's election, this is what Frederick Douglass says. He says, "If speech alone could have abolished slavery, the work would have been done long ago. What we want is anti-slavery government in harmony with our anti-slavery speech, one which will give effect to our words and translate them into acts. For this, the ballot is needed. And if this will not be heard or heeded, then the bullet. We have had enough and we are sick of it." And when I think about this speech, I'm like, wow, like the shift that Black leadership took from moral suasion and turning their cheeks to all of a sudden it's the ballot or the bullet. It's not just a moral issue, it's a political issue. How we think about the abolition of the institution of slavery becomes so much more involved than just the question of slavery being a sin. I think about Lucy Staton of Oberlin College, who said, "Slavery is the combination of all crime. It is war. It is war. Slavery is warfare. It is warfare against humanity. It is warfare against your fellow man, to enslave them, to shackle them, to put them in bondage. It is the combination of all crime to rob children from their mothers, to rob consent from Black women. It is war." And then I think about Abby Kelly. Abby Kelly is a white woman, a Quaker at that, who's pacifist, right? And Abby Kelly says, "Since slavery was maintained by force, it must be justly opposed in the same way." She added, "The question is not whether we shall counsel the slaves to forsake peace and commence war. The war exists already and has been waged unremittingly ever since the slave has been in bondage. So in a lot of ways, Abby Kellie is in total agreement with Stanton, right? She was like, yeah, slavery is warfare. We shouldn't be acting like violence is something that's negotiable, or no, we take violence off the table. Violence is the table. It is the table in which everyone has to come and address this issue. And then, of course, I like to quote my favorite, James McCune Smith, who talks about the philosophy of force in such a bold, I think in new and nuanced way. He says, our white brethren cannot understand us lest we speak to them in their own language. They recognize only the philosophy of force. And what McCune Smith is saying is he's trying to talk about freedoms given versus freedoms won. And he's like, we don't want freedoms given. We don't want freedoms that have been purchased on our behalf, that really set the tone and the terms for how we can engage in our own liberation. And he talks about the hypocrisy of, Great Britain's emancipation. And he says, stop celebrating them. Stop celebrating Great Britain like they abolished slavery non-violently. He's like, these were freedoms given. You don't want that. And not only that, the British government compensated British Panthers over 20 million pounds. So he's like, they legitimated the fact that you are in fact property and not people, right? They paid for you a ransom, if you will, for this freedom that you experience. And of course, he references Haiti and other, Black rebellion leaders that push this philosophy of force and push the idea of a freedom that's taken and not a freedom that's given. And then again, I always come back to Frederick Douglass because he too is my historical boyfriend. And he just has great quotes, great quotes. And he always cuts to the heart of the matter. He says, and this is shortly after the Civil War ended, he's talking about the force of the events being the Civil War. He says, during the force of events, the American public discovered and accepted more truth in 4 years of Civil War than they learned in 40 years of peace. More truth in 4 years of Civil War than they learned in 40 years of peace. He's basically saying, like, listen, we tried this for decades. Remember in the 1830s when we were turning the other cheek? Remember when we were trying to morally persuade you? You didn't want to hear it until we fought a war. And now everyone's listening and everyone's, more important, learning from these hard lessons. So I asked the question throughout the book, like, what can force accomplish that moral suasion cannot? And I think the answer to that is simple. I think it's freedom. When I think about the over 250,000 Black soldiers that fought in the Civil War, that are credited for changing the tide of the war into a Union victory, I think about how important it has to have force to bring about one's freedom, essentially forcing freedom. I think it's so important in how we understand how change gets instituted and what makes change legitimate. I think violence does a lot of that explaining, physically, intellectually, and certainly verbally as well. So as I wrap up, this is the last slide I want to have. I know I'm going to leave a lot of time for questions and Q&A, but I think my book has prompted me to think a lot about contemporary protest and how should we think about, how activists can make use of their own ability to evoke and bring about change, or for the powerless to procure power, or how the oppressed should respond to their oppressors. And I think about this a lot because all throughout Black history, throughout the lived experiences of Black Americans, I think that we will find this one thing to be true. And that is, there is no form of protest that white supremacy is going to sanction. There's no form of protest that white supremacy is going to be like, you know what? I'm okay with that, right? Like, whether it is striking or marching, or throwing a Molotov cocktail, or taking a knee, or taking a forceful stance, people lose their minds no matter what, right? Because white supremacy will never relinquish its power, not without demand. And that goes back to another Frederick Douglass quote where he says, power concedes nothing without demand. And he's not wrong about that. So that I want to close and take any of the questions that you have. Again, thanks so much for having me. This has been fun. I'm going to stop sharing my screen too, so we can open it up for questions.
Thank you. Great job. All right, so let's see. I saw Rick, your hand was up.
That was an accident, but since you called me. So I agree 100% with your thesis about the role of violence. I'm a firearm safety instructor, and I work with a number of groups that prepare to do our own self-protection. But my question is, how do we encourage this present generation to understand that there is a continuum of abolitionist types of characteristics that needs to be infused in our social media, in our physical aspects, in our protection of our neighborhoods? How do we mind them that though what we're talking about today happened 200 or 300 years ago, the problem still exists, and so the solution to this problem ought to still exist?
Oh, for sure, for sure. You know, I think that's why I love being a historian so much, because I feel like history is a blueprint, or it's a roadmap for understanding like where we have been and where we can go. And I think, you know, I use this a lot when people talk about abolish the police, for example, and they're like, oh my gosh, we can't live without the police. Oh my gosh, what do you mean abolish the police? And it's like, well, hold up. The police have not existed forever, right? As an institution, the police have not always been around. So if we have lived in a world for thousands of years without the police, then we can actually think about a world in which we don't have this institution, right? Because it's not that old and it's not that long ago before we had these things in place. And I think that's what history does. It teaches us about what has always been there and what is new and what is evolved, right? Or reincarnated in different ways. And how can we think about what has been effective, but also equally important, what has failed, what has not worked. And I think that's always useful for me in thinking about what are the best strategies in going forward and what has been most effective. I always look to the past to see what might be available to me in the present.
Thank you. Dr. Barnes, hands up.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Carter Jackson. That was a wonderful presentation and so engaging, right? We're always trying to get students to get into history, and sometimes they think it's back then and boring, and you really bring it to life. I really appreciated your presentation. My question has to do, so I already had this question, but the last thing that you said really made me think about it, because you said history helps us to understand what has worked and what hasn't worked. Mm-hmm. And I know there are a lot of young people right now who are feeling like the ballot hasn't been working, right? Our political system isn't working for us, and so they're deciding to tap out, right, of voting, right? Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask you about that, because that was a huge struggle, right? That's been a lot of the African-American struggle, has been for the right to vote. Absolutely. And then not having impediments, right? To once you have the right to vote, not being obstructed from voting. Yes. Yes. And now we're at this point where two things seem to be happening at the same time. One is that we're being obstructed yet again. Mm-hmm. And the other is we actually have some members of our community who are saying the vote doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering, if you can tell us about what history has told you about what we can do to make it something that students, young people, are really working towards and fighting for.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I push back hard on the idea that the vote does not matter or does not work. If it didn't work, no one would be trying to keep us from the polls. Like that's the most obvious thing right there. For like sure. Clearly it works because people stormed the Capitol over election results, right? People lost their minds over voting. And not only that, I think people realize that when Black people have political power, that they have the ability to influence what is done. And when I say Black power, I don't mean like the reverse of white power. I mean just the ability to affect change, right? That is what the ballot does. And I have never seen a more effective use of the ballot than during Reconstruction. So Reconstruction to me is like probably one of my favorite periods to study, because my mind gets blown when I think about how in a short amount of time, Black people had schools, they had banks, they had businesses, they were elected officials. Nowhere in the Atlantic world, not in Brazil, not in Cuba, well, Haiti, yes, but that's different. But like nowhere in the Atlantic world do you have someone like Robert Smalls existing. Do you have someone who was a slave in South Carolina and then goes back home, becomes an elected official, and is like going to Congress, like making laws. Like not only were they making laws, they were building roads, they were building schools, they were building institutions for the insane and for the affirm and for the elderly. Like Black children actually had a higher quality level of education during Reconstruction than poor white children did. And that to me just shows me how important the ballot was, because one of the first things that happens when Reconstruction ends as a way to really put that nail in the coffin is to roll back voting rights. So you get the grandfather clauses and you get the poll tax, you get the literacy tax, because white people understood when Black people have political power, they make miracles happen. And I just think that to me, the ballot is so important, so important. Otherwise, it would not be up for grabs in the way that it is. People would not be acting crazy over curriculum and critical race theory and all of this stuff. It's always about the ballot and who can impact change. So I encourage everyone, if you are not registered to vote, get registered to vote, right? Like it is so important to make sure that you have a say and that you choose your elected officials or that you become an elected official.
Thank you so much for that. And it's interesting that Reconstruction is another one of those historical moments that are not taught.
Not taught, least taught, least understood. People forget about Reconstruction. It's like the Civil War and then, okay, the Great Depression. Wait, what? We just skipped a whole generation, a whole decade. But we fast forward, and next thing we're on to World War II. Next thing we're on, we intentionally bypass Reconstruction. Or we say, it failed, and we keep it moving. And it failed because it was successful.
I have a question for the audience. What was the role of Black and white churches during this Black abolitionist period you're talking about?
Oh man, the church. There's a whole book to be written about the church. I talk a little bit about the church and religion. It's not so much of a focal point in my book, but I will say this. There is a real split and divide between how Black people used or understood the Bible and how white people understood the Bible. And enslaved people are very much Old Testament, right? Like, listen, slaveholder, you are Egypt, you are Pharaoh, right? We are the Israelites, we are oppressed. Let my people go. Like they're looking at scripture in the Old Testament also as a roadmap and a guidebook for what is needed, required, and the justice that will be doled out if it does not happen. White people are also looking at the Bible and they're looking at the New Testament and they're like, Paul says slaves obey your masters, right? Like they're using the same sort of scripture to weaponize against one another. And that is why you see these major splits that exist today when MLK says, 12 o'clock on a Sunday is like the most segregated hour. When you think about the Southern Baptist Convention, it's called the Southern Baptist Convention because they were slaveholders that did not want to stay with the Baptist church because no, we want to keep our slaves. We want to keep our slaves. Matter of fact, slavery is a moral institution and it civilizes Black people. They came up with all of these like mental gymnastics to justify slavery. But I think what's interesting about this moment is that when you look at the Black church, it's so instrumental in the Black community. All of the leaders and the great ministers become like also political figures that help bring about a lot of progress and change that we see in the 19th century. The same as in the long freedom struggle. We see ministers, people like MLK, and even people like Malcolm X, who's also a religious figure, pushing these ideas moralistically and politically to the center. Now, like in the current Black Lives Matter movement, I don't see the church as prominent or as loud as it was in the 19th or 20th century. But you know who is really loud? The white evangelical church. The white evangelical church is now like setting the terms for what they want or don't want for the GOP. Like, and I think to me, it's more interesting to see how white people have used their own faith to justify their supremacy and to justify their own racism than Black people have. And that to me is something that just remains.
Thank you. Any questions in the chat? Let's see. I've got a lot of compliments there. You got a lot of enthusiasm.
I love what I do. I really do. I love what I do. And you know, it's hard. I wish if I were with an audience, you know, I feed off that energy a little bit more. So I gotta be my own energy, but it's okay.
Right. So I have a question. We talk about, if you want to explain to folks, this whole American exceptionalism. We look at the K through 12 history. As you know, when students come to our classes, I'm less and less shocked as I get older because I know how the K through 12 history socialized to make one a good citizen. Then you have people out here who are college graduates, may take one course, and of course, they think they're experts. So you talk about this whole self-defense, 19th century, or even Robert Williams later. How does this challenge that American exceptionalism myth that it's just this fundamental belief that in those two periods, white abolitionists or white on the left, that there's this myth that A, they're a majority, and B, that Black people have been waiting around for this light. And it's hard to shift the narrative, like you said, you put the agency on African Americans who's not been waiting for anything. Right? So how do, when you confront changing that narrative that the abolitionists, you get to NAACP, then they jump to the 60s, but they were never a majority.
No.
Been African Americans, but that just gets misslided, reinterpreted. How do you engage with students?
Completely missed. You know, I have to tell, my students are shocked when I tell them that the abolitionists are only like 1% of the population, very, very small number, because they think that all of the North is an abolitionist. And I'm like, no, first of all, there's a difference between being anti-slavery and being an abolitionist. You know, an abolitionist is out there in those streets campaigning, slavery must go, slavery must end. But most Northerners were hella racist, and most Northerners are only anti-slavery because they understand that slavery impacts their economic bottom line. So no one's gonna pay a white person $10 an hour when they've got a slave to do it for free and for the rest of their lives. So in the North, the push against slavery was, I don't want your enslaved people undercutting my wage, undercutting my livelihood. And I also don't like you Black people either, right? Like, that is how the North felt about Black people. There were laws in free states that, you know, they tried to ban Black people from entering Illinois altogether. They tried to ban Black people from entering Ohio. Like, there were real anti-abolitionist campaigns in places like Massachusetts, Western Massachusetts, like Lowell, where they were the major textile companies that produced all that cotton and manufactured all that cotton. You had a lot of pushback in the North. And at one point during the Civil War, New York City thought about seceding with the South. New York City was like, actually, we have all these banks, we have all these insurance companies, you know, like maybe we should go with the South. Like, it doesn't happen. But I say all this to say that people don't understand the allegiance that white people, North and South, had to white supremacy, that it runs deep and it is a part of the same cloth. And so both the North and the South had a real motivation about keeping Black people out economically, keeping Black people out politically, but also keeping Black people out intellectually. Because if I sell you a story and I tell you I'm a hero in it, right? Then of course you're not gonna look for people who might have been helpers or who might have been like center stage. You're only gonna believe what I tell you. And so much about American history has been the celebration, the glorification of a white savior North, of a white savior abolitionist, of the liberal white person whose heart is bleeding for Black people. And it trumps Black voices and Black agency and even Black humanity. And so we really have so much work to do when it comes to rewriting this history. You know, funny story, I had this guy tell me, like, I told him I was a historian, and he said, huh, that's funny. You might not have much to do because everything's been written already. And I was like, what? What do you mean everything's been written already? And it's like, yeah, what else is there to say about Lincoln or the Civil War? It's already, we wrote that 100 years ago.
He wrote it.
None of this has been written. Matter of fact, all of this is being rewritten, and that's where the work starts.
Good. Stanley, you have your hand up?
Yes, I have questions. I'm not even sure how to articulate the questions I have. But thank you so much for writing the book. I mean, normally you hear about abolitionists who took up arms. It's just John Brown.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it, and that's that white savior figure. Also, I'm gonna take this John Anderson quote. I'm gonna put it on a bumper sticker. If you persist in pursuing me, I will slay you. I wanna ask you, you talked about something freedom given or freedom taken.
Yeah, freedom's given versus freedom's won.
Okay, and then you have say black historical Black figures. You have a nonviolent figure of a faction, of an ideology or belief of Black folk. Then you have on the other side, you have this faction of Black folks who take up arms. Mm-hmm. So, and then you have the white power structure in the middle, trying to figure out what they're going to do about what's ahead. Yeah. For instance, integration, yeah. or the 13th Amendment. Yeah. So, and that dictates maybe which leader or which faction they're gonna negotiate with. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's I mean, how do you have to have one without the other, or do they pit one against the other?
I know. I think you need negotiate. Both. I think you need both. I think you need Black people that are willing to fight, and you need Black people that are willing to flee, and you need Black people that are willing to fight and flee, as in John Anderson had to do. I mean, I think we need a whole range of tactics. And what I love about the abolitionists is that they didn't just have these quasi-military groups. They also had the press, they had newspapers, they had letter writing campaigns. They tried to push for politics. They tried to push morally throughout the church. They tried to use everything in their toolkit to bring about not just the emancipation of enslaved people, but also equality, and to get people to understand that, like, I am a human being, right? I bleed blood, right? Like, that was a big part of it. And so for me, it was never just one tool. It's never just about guns. And I think that there has to be, nuance and fluidity, because someone like Frederick Douglass, for the longest, he was a Garrisonite. He was like, yeah, moral suasion, nonviolence. And then he gets attacked by a mob, and he's like, wait a minute, like, I will not lay down and die, right? I have to defend myself. Self-defense should never be off the table. And I think this is something that's interesting also when I talk about white supremacy, is that white supremacy in its essence is violence. It is violence. That is all white supremacy is. It is violence. It is violence rhetoric. It is sexual violence. It is political violence. It is economic robbery and violence. It is violence. When Black people use violence against white supremacy, it is not to perpetuate violence, it is to halt violence, to arrest violence, to stop it. And so when I think about, like the Haitian Revolution and also, Black rebellions, it was not about becoming the master. It was about stopping the master wholesale and then creating something new, creating something better, creating a world that everyone could live in. And so, yeah, we have a lot of tactics at our disposal, but it's never about perpetuating violence for violence sake. That's what white supremacy is.
One more question. In your book, I think I read something. You said violence as political language, and contrast that with the GOP just now saying that the events on January 6th is legitimate political discourse. What differentiates those one from the other? Is it because they're the power structure, so you have to look at it differently?
Oh, I mean, it's just hypocrisy. And it's absurd. It is, when I talk about political violence and violence as a political language, I'm saying if you don't have the ballot, if you don't have citizenship, if you don't have rights, how else do you communicate your agency, your humanity, your ability to protect yourself? Violence becomes a language that people respond to, something that people hear, right? We clearly stop when we see or hear violence. And that is how it communicates. But when white people are engaging in violence, it is purely for domination, right? And so to say that, oh, well, this is a legitimate, sure, it's legitimate within a framework of white supremacy because it only operates off of violence, violence to dominate, violence to conquer, violence to steal. And I think that we have to be honest about what those engagements are, because that's what the South said, right? Like, it's states' rights, it's legitimate, but really you're fighting all of these things over the institution of slavery, over the ability to dominate and keep human people in bondage. And, we're never honest about why the South seceded. We say it's states' rights, but we know it's about states' rights to keep people as property. And that is the end of the clause that we never get to.
Thank you there, Stan. I have a question from a student. Do you think people's ignorance about how the ballot works has contributed to younger generations believing it does not work? And how can we inform them of how the ballot works?
Can you say the question one more time? Do
you think people's ignorance about how the ballot works has contributed to younger generations believing it does not work? And how can we inform them of how it works?
That's really good. I understand why people have a sense of apathy about voting. I think because if you grow up in a world in which the only way you understand power is through whiteness or purpose or wealth or prosperity or quality of life is through whiteness, you don't see the ballot as being very effective because you think that that's only for white people, right? That protects their power. That doesn't gain me any power. That doesn't give me any power. But I push back on that because I think so much about the ballot is effective in changing the way that we live our lives. But politics alone won't save us, right? There's so much about Reconstruction that is a political revolution, but it's not an economic one, right? Like votes don't put food on the table, and I'm very sympathetic about that. When I think about MLK and him giving a speech, I think it's in 1966, and he gets booed. And he gets booed because he's like, yeah, because votes don't put food on the table, because votes don't create jobs, because votes don't get children necessarily educated or access to the kind of wealth that people are trying to gain. So it has to be more than just politics alone. You have to couple politics with an economic revolution, not just a political revolution, but an economic revolution. And you got to get buy-in. And I think white people are willing to concede a lot of things symbolically and politically, but once you start digging in someone's pocket, and we saw that with the Poor People's March, right? We saw that even in 2020, we will give you the Confederate flag, we'll give you Aunt Jemima, but don't come for my coin, right? Like that's a real block. And I think it keeps people from seeing that the ballot can be useful. It's not that the ballot's ineffective, it's that it has to be tethered to other things in order to make it really manifest in our lives.
Thank you. Here's another question. Do you think the 21st century leaders such as Obama and Oprah need or could do more specifically in helping the Black community and not just supporting the overall public? Past leaders you described specifically had goals of aiding this community, but today's leaders seems to have way more interest who do not allow all of their time to be focused on it.
That is a good question. You know, I'm going to say something that's probably not, I don't know, that probably a lot of people don't say, but I think you will never lose telling white people what they want to hear. You will never lose. Matter of fact, it's lucrative. It is so lucrative keeping white people comfortable, making white people happy, making white people feel included and special, right? Like, if that is your platform, you will stay winning. You will get all the awards. And I think that there's something about celebrity and wealth that stunts your sense of activism and community and collectivism that is required to think about those who have not made it yet for themselves. And I think that we are not aspiring to be Fannie Lou Hamer or Septima Clark or other leaders that have used collectivism as for upward mobility, right? Lift and climb, lift and climb. That's the idea that we have. It's not just for me, it's for all of us, right? I'm not free until we're all free. I think that becomes harder and harder to think that way when the almighty dollar comes in, when fame comes in, when votes come in, when, you know, like when all of these very seductive things that say like, hey, you've opted out of this, right? Like, you don't need this anymore. That's difficult. I won't say that Barack Obama and Oprah are, you know, like anomalies or alone in that thinking. When I think of someone like Jay-Z, who's like, my presence is charity. Really? Your presence is not charity. Your presence is not helping anybody get free, Jay-Z. Like, so I do think that that we can have a healthy discourse with the people that we love, right? And kind of call them back to say, hey, listen, like, you have a platform, you have an ability to do and say more, but also recognize that the moment they start to do and say more on behalf of Black people, white people turn off that faucet. They turn off the fame faucet, they turn off the money faucet, they turn off all the things that got them to where they were. So in some ways, you know, it's a catch-22. You got to do this work knowing that you might never win a Pulitzer, right? I might never get the MacArthur Genius Award, right? And I think that I'm also careful that if I do get those things, well, snap. Am I somehow forgetting about the things? Have I written things that have made white people comfortable? You know, my cover does not make white people comfortable. You know what I mean? Like, people look at this cover and they're like, it's a gun? Yeah, it's a gun. You know, like, so, you know, it's hard though. It's hard to keep that framework.
Mm-hmm. Next, will there be a third Reconstruction?
I don't know. I hope not. And let me say why I say that. I don't want another 11 years of what feels like a good deal and then have it get snatched away, right? Like, you know, Reconstruction was short-lived. It wasn't a failure, but it wasn't allowed to have longevity. It wasn't allowed to become a part of the new world order that we all live our lives in. It was a renaissance, if you will, a small, brief pocket in which W.E.B. Du Bois says, like, the enslaved stood free in the sun and then went right back in the darkness. I don't want to go right back in the darkness. Like, I don't want to have a moment where we're like, Obama, yay, or Black president, yay. And then we get Trump. You know what I mean? Like, when you think about Reconstruction, Lincoln shot, and then it's Andrew Johnson. Like, those were hard times. So no, I don't want Reconstruction. I want a revolution. And a revolution is a new world order, a new institution, a new framework. It is a new beginning. And that's what I want more than anything.
Yeah, you're not going to get the MacArthur Genius Award or the Pulitzer. You want a revolution?
Can I say something? So
And Bell Hooks didn't get one either, and I'm okay with that. A lot of the great did not get those things, and I am okay being
You want a revolution?
So at the beginning of my semester, I asked all of my students, are they revolutionaries? And that is because there is this manifold approach to revolution. The problem is a significant number of them don't even know what revolution means. Yeah. I'm serious. It's not a bad thing. I'm just saying that to approach the idea of revolution, we have to go back and even explain what it means to be a revolutionary. Yeah. And I think that we have bought into this apathetic approach to it's comfortable now. Yeah. So let's not overturn the boat, when in fact white folks are still ramping it up. We saw that January 6th. So, you know, I think we have to do a better job of introducing this notion of revolution. You may remember there was this guy named Gil Scott-Heron, and he was one of the first real rappers, went to Lincoln University. And he said, the revolution will not be televised.
Nope, it won't. And
that will be on social media.
Yeah, no, it won't. But I also think that the revolution is actually not that revolutionary, right? It's clean water. It's access to safety. It is, you know, fair and decent housing, right? Like it's schooling that is equitable, right? It's everything. Like when I remember they asked AOC, like, well, what does defund the police look like? And she's like, it looks like the suburbs, right? Like it looks like how white people operate in their everyday lives with the police. Like we're not asking for anarchy. We're asking for the same protections that white people have, that they live their lives in, and never think once or twice about the police being a danger to them. I actually think it's not that complicated to think about a world that we all want to live in, because white people live in that world every single day.
How do we achieve that? I mean, I'm looking at our system, and I just see it as a perpetual, like Sisyphus rolling that rock up the hill. We make progress. They block it or pass legislation to hinder our progress. We make progress. They pass this legislation to hinder. It's like an ongoing type thing, and I don't know. I'm thinking we have a two-party system. I don't know if we're ever. I think we should just take over the Democratic Party, like the far right just taking over the Republican Party. I think that's the quickest way to do it. But I don't.
Honestly,
I don't.
You're not gonna like my answer, but like I don't know. And I say I don't know because if I could give you like, here's the 3-point plan for how we get free, you know, I would be a millionaire. Like I can at best, I can tell you what won't work, right? And I think that that's useful too, right? I can do what Miriam Cobber says. She says, you know, we may not know what defund the police completely looks like, but we can say not this. We can say not the prison pipeline, not the prison pipeline, not, you know, police brutality, not having a knee in your neck, not this won't work, this ain't it. And I think a lot of what scholars and community activists, because it takes everybody, the person in the comment is absolutely right. You know, Du Bois's talented 10th won't get us there. Academia is not going to get us there. It requires everybody to be thinking about what has failed, what won't work, and what might work, and trying that. But here's something else to consider. We have been a country of slaves for hundreds of years longer than we have been a country of free people. And that I think is worth sitting with, because this will not happen overnight, and it is not likely to happen in my generation or my children's generation or their children's generation. But that also doesn't mean that it can't happen. It also doesn't mean that it's not possible. But will it take time? Absolutely.
I see some good conversation in the chat, and we have 727. There's one more question. I'm going to ask that. It's What would be a role of violence for a modern day abolitionist or person fighting against injustices?
You know, you're not gonna like this answer either. But it's not a fair fight. It's not a fair fight. So when we think about the 19th century, you know, there weren't policing forces back then. I mean, there were slave catchers, but not really the police force. And it was a lot of the Wild Wild West. And a lot of that we look back on, I think we can all say slavery was wrong. I think we can all consider a person who might use violence like John Anderson and say, yeah, that makes sense. I get that. He had to do what he had to do. I think we can look at the long freedom struggle and we can see the Klan and we can say, yeah, it makes sense that, you know, by any means necessary. It makes sense that Ida B. Wells is armed or Fannie Lou Hamer is armed and the Deacons of Self-Defense and the Black Panthers. We can sympathize with that because we see segregation as violence and segregation as harmful. But as we get to something that feels more progressive, it gets more difficult to define what is legitimate and what is wrong or bad or problematic. So if I can look at slavery and say it's bad 100 years later, or segregation is bad 70, 50 years later, you know, we're not in the moment where we can still define like racism in the way and get on equal footing with what is problematic about racism. I hope that makes sense. So I don't think that there's a way that we can use force for sure. Violence, I don't know. But remember, like, force is not necessarily violence. Violence is always violence, but force is a boycott. Force is a strike. Force is your vote, right? Force is a lot of different things. And I think we can employ force, but when it comes to violence, we can't use the master's tools. They've got tanks, they've got drones, they've got armies. And we look like children with rocks. And it's really hard to be able to employ violence in the way that we think we can. I don't think that would work. The state is just way too powerful, and the terms are not set to where everyone has equal resources.
I think that's a good point. I think that's why history changed over time, right? There was no police force 1830. So first round one, you got the police, National Guard. There's levels to it. Shout out to Meek Mills. There's levels to it in terms of the protection, right? But the vote, I mean, you see it's real simple, right? When young people vote, 2008, this is all because you didn't grab any, you just went and pulled down the ballot.
Yeah.
Take that perspective right there, and you see the backlash just on voting. So yes, that's why history changed over time.
Strikes and boycotts, I think, are the most effective tools. If white supremacy wants nothing else, it's for you to take $1 out of its pocket. So a strike, a boycott, a vote, I think does a lot of that work. Not all of it, but I think it compels people to relinquish more of their power when they realize that their coin is on the line.
Well, we appreciate the conversation. We probably go on for another 3-4 hours, but you know, churches eventually got to end. Well, I appreciate all my colleagues tonight. Appreciate my colleague Stanley Richardson doing his thing, and of course, Dr. Kellie Carter Jackson. Where are you from originally, Kellie?
What'd you say?
Where are you originally from?
I am a nomad. I was born in Detroit and raised in Illinois, and I did high school in Texas, and then I've moved every 4 years since then. Wow. So I've lived in North Dakota, I've lived in Spokane, Washington, in Washington, D.C., in California, in Little Rock, Arkansas, in Brooklyn, New York, and now I'm in Sherborne, Massachusetts.
I was going to guess New York when you said sun. Okay.
I also tend to take up the language of every place that I've lived.
I have a niece. You have the same laugh as one of my nieces. Just that same laugh.
Well, again, I'd like to thank everyone. This was great. And for those of you who follow us at UF_AFA, this time next year, we're going to be doing this live on campus. We're bringing the speakers on campus, but we thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. This was great. Everybody have a good night. And again, follow us at UF_AFA. Everyone have a good night. Be safe out there.
I'm going to get your book too. So yeah, yes. Get the book.
Yes, get the book. Get the book. I'll sign it if I need to.
Man, get the book.
Thank you. Have a good night.
All right, y'all. Bye-bye.
Bye.